contemporary world. While there is not only reference to Israel's prostitution, infidelity, and boldness, all qualities that reflected negatively on women at the time, there are also many positive references, even very romantic ones, to women's beauty. Nevertheless, Weems' conclusion is, and this is in her words, that this is a metaphor that has gone awry. And while I cannot do justice to her book here in such a short time, let me suggest that we simply look carefully at the use of this marriage metaphor and that a wholesale embrace of the marriage metaphor for describing the way that we are to be with God is potentially very dangerous. And she spent some time actually talking about how this focuses the way that we think about women as being in need of control at sort of at best and at worst needing to be punished and disciplined. In Weems' conclusion, she writes that the marriage metaphor, and I'll quote again from her, has become the interpretive grid through which one relates to and conceptualizes God. Although the promiscuous wife metaphor is not the dominant biblical metaphor, whereby one could not think or speak about God without thinking of God as a husband, it does function, she says, as an important auxiliary metaphor inasmuch as it reinforces what has come to be the dominant image for conceptualizing God, namely, that God is male. And that's to end her quote. Now, my own response to the Vatican Statement on Women acknowledges that there is much that is good in this statement. But, as I noted in my article, one of the problematic parts of it was that the maleness of Jesus and the implicit maleness of God were not only assumed, but highlighted. Feminists were criticized for their downplaying of Jesus' maleness. And my point in the article was to say that understanding God as male veers dangerously close to idolatry. But what are the implications of this metaphor for women's gifts being welcomed by the church? Now, as I have already noted, many of the gifts that women have to offer are very much welcomed. Women are in Vatican commissions. Women work in parishes as pastoral associates, directors of religious education, in all kinds of ways. Women are theologians, heads of religious communities, missionaries, etc., etc. And the Vatican has gone on record stressing the importance of women's contributions not only to society, but to the church as well. But there are some areas where women encounter a sign that says quite clearly, no admission. And I don't mean the priesthood here. What I mean are some of the ministries that are at this point reserved to the priesthood alone and where women's gifts, I think, are very much needed. And I will focus on three: preaching, reconciliation, and governance. The whole question of ordination is a complex one, and we can get into some of the issues at stake if we want to later on, but I don't want to focus on that. I want to be more specific about the losses that the church experiences without women being able to share these particular gifts. And I want to raise some questions about how these particular gifts being reserved to the priesthood alone impoverish the church. And this, I think, is not only an impoverishment, but an injustice, not only to women, but I think, but also to the whole church. Now, let me first talk about preaching. Preaching is a charism. It's a gift of the Spirit. It's a gift to be able to crack open the often opaque scriptures, to bring one's education and experience to discerning where God is working among us in the word that we hear. Now, my own parish, which is actually the Newman Center at Northwestern University, we're extremely fortunate to have a pastor who is a very gifted preacher. And the regular priest substitutes are, with an occasional exception, similarly gifted, although in different ways. We are treated as adults who are intelligent, and our priest preachers work hard to make their homilies thoughtful and inspiring. We also have a pastoral associate, a woman married with 2 college-age daughters, who is also a gifted preacher. She works full-time in helping to run the center. She does spiritual direction, adult education, and a number of other things. And she preaches for the church about 4 times a year. And every time this happens, someone writes the archdiocese and complains that we are violating canon law. But what do we hear from Mary when she preaches? She, by the way, happens to have a PhD in biblical studies. She's able to share her knowledge of the scriptures, her experiences as a wife and mother, her distinct personal take on the messages of the Word. Our congregation benefits so immensely from this. Our pastor, for all his gifts, lacks the experience of both high-level scriptural knowledge and of being married. Similarly, Mary lacks his experience of celibate priesthood, another distinct charism. Together, they are able to enrich our understanding of the Word. With only one, I think our experience would be poorer. Now, as may be the experience here, many churches, like my own and my own university, are open to women preaching occasionally. And 2 years ago, I was actually invited to give the homily at the baccalaureate mass just before graduation. And it was a real honor to do that. All of this has to be done very carefully, so as not to offend anyone. And we have to say, she's not preaching, she's offering reflections, and maybe it can't be done right after the gospel, maybe we have to wait till the end of Mass. I call this all this elaborate dance so that we don't break the rules. But what's at stake here? We're not talking about just letting anybody into the pulpit. We're talking about people who have the potential to bring the Spirit to our lives in many ways. Without women's gifts of interpretation of the scriptures, our lives are just poor. Even though there are a few places where this is done on a limited and careful basis, it is still very much not the norm. And think of the loss to the church and what women can do with scriptural passages about marriage, about love, about all of the things that God has to tell us. And I think we're poor when we can't crack this open with women's help. Now, my second example has to do with reconciliation. Now, since I wrote my book on women in the sacraments 6 years ago, seems like yesterday, I've lectured on women in the sacraments in a number of places. And everywhere I go, I hear story after story about women in reconciliation. And I suspect there may be a few here as well. Let me explain. We are all aware of the shortage of priests. This, I want to make you emphasize here, is not a shortage of vocations. And the difficulty that people at the bedsides of the sick and dying experience in being able to get a priest to be there with them. And this is not just an issue for those who minister with the sick and the dying. It is true for those who do any kind of ministry that involves working with people who may experience difficulty in their relationships. And I think that's everybody, at least my experience. Now, as you know, women are now involved in ministries of chaplaincy to hospitals, and many women have also become spiritual directors. Now, technically, women are not chaplains, but people haven't paid too much attention to that. Women's gifts of ministering to those who wish to deepen their relationship with God and their families, friends, and even enemies are a great gift to the church. And I have benefited from having a spiritual director who's a woman. But what happens in the hospital when Father is somewhere else, often at the bedside of someone else, at a parish council meeting, trying to get the finances sorted out, or presiding at a liturgy far away because there are no priests there. Father, as we all know, is stretched thin. So the hospital chaplain is there, and she is often someone who has visited with the person in need, perhaps at the outpatient clinic, where the patient may have had chemotherapy, or during a hospital visit when the patient needs a transfusion, and now the patient is at the end of her journey and wishes to receive the blessing of the church. And Father can't be reached. Now, what many chaplains are doing is hearing the words of the person in need of reconciliation and blessing. They are offering the grace of God's love to those most in need and are standing with the families at a time when God's loving care can seem very far away. Are they acting as sacramental ministers? Well, the women that I talked to for my book said to me over the years, it all depends on what you mean by sacraments. Can God's grace be mediated through an unordained woman? Of course. Is this an official sacrament in that it is an act of the whole church? Well, no, not officially. But here again is where the gifts of women to reconcile, anoint, comfort, and to offer the church's solidarity at a time of great need